I saw my sister and she said, "You have to go home." I have chills even talking about it. Instantly I knew something was wrong. I didn't quite pinpoint it yet because...
For 47 years, Elvis Presley's coffin has remained one of the most fiercely protected burial sites in American history. Not because of what everyone assumes is inside, but because of the questions that have never stopped swirling around it. Graceland's meditation garden, where Elvis supposedly rests beside his parents and grandmother, attracts millions of visitors who come to pay respects, leave flowers, and stand in quiet reverence before the bronze plaque bearing his name. But beneath the surface of that peaceful scene, a different kind of energy has always hummed. The persistent, uncomfortable whisper that something about the official story doesn't quite add up. Recently, that whisper became impossible to ignore. A coalition of forensic scientists, medical researchers, and representatives from the Presley estate reached an agreement that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. Using advanced imaging technology that didn't exist when Elvis died in 1977, they would conduct a non-invasive examination of his coffin. The stated goal was straightforward enough: to settle certain medical questions, update historical records, and potentially provide closure to decades of speculation. But everyone involved understood the real weight of what they were doing. This examination could either confirm what the world has believed for nearly half a century, or it could crack open a mystery that refuses to stay buried. The pressure for this kind of investigation had been building for decades, though it rarely made mainstream headlines. Conspiracy theorists had long demanded proof that Elvis was actually in that grave, pointing to irregularities in the original burial that they claimed warranted serious scrutiny. Most of these voices were easy to dismiss as obsessive fans, unwilling to accept their hero's death. But mixed among them were forensic professionals, medical examiners, and researchers who raised questions that weren't so simple to wave away. They pointed to the rushed autopsy, the sealed medical records that remained locked away for decades, the conflicting testimonies from people who were present at Graceland on the night Elvis died. None of this proved anything on its own, but taken together, it created a pattern of uncertainty that legitimate investigators found troubling. What changed the equation was technology. Modern forensic science has developed imaging techniques capable of revealing detailed information about sealed containers without ever disturbing their contents. Ground-penetrating radar, density analysis, and advanced scanning methods can now determine the composition, weight distribution, and structural characteristics of objects that would have been completely opaque to investigators in 1977. When these capabilities reached a certain threshold of reliability, the arguments for examining Elvis's coffin shifted from theoretical to practical. It was no longer a question of whether such an examination was possible, but whether anyone would have the courage and the authorization to conduct one. The morning the examination took place, Graceland's grounds were closed to the public under the pretense of routine maintenance. A small team of specialists arrived before dawn, their equipment transported in unmarked vehicles to avoid attracting attention. The atmosphere was tense in a way that surprised even the scientists involved. These were professionals who had examined crime scenes, disaster sites, and historical remains without flinching. But something about this particular assignment felt different. They weren't just analyzing physical evidence. They were touching the third rail of American cultural mythology. Whatever they found would either validate the beliefs of millions or shatter them entirely. The initial setup took longer than expected. Calibrating the equipment to account for the specific conditions of the burial site required adjustments that hadn't been necessary in previous examinations. The soil composition, the depth of the grave, the materials used in the coffin's construction, all of these factors had to be precisely measured before any meaningful data could be collected. By the time the first scans began, the sun had risen over Graceland, casting long shadows across the meditation garden, where tourists would normally be gathering for their first glimpse of Elvis's final resting place. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one involved had fully anticipated. The lead forensic examiner, a woman with 30 years of experience in non-invasive burial analysis, was the first to notice that something wasn't right. Her initial readings showed density patterns that didn't match the expected profile for human remains interred for 47 years. The weight distribution within the coffin appeared inconsistent with standard burial configurations. These discrepancies might have had mundane explanations, variations in embalming techniques, memorial items placed alongside the body, unusual coffin construction materials. A phone call was placed to estate representatives before any further scans were conducted. The conversation was brief, but witnesses described the forensic examiner's expression shifting from professional concern to something closer to genuine alarm. Whatever she had seen in those preliminary readings, it was enough to transform what should have been a routine verification into something far more complicated. The question everyone had been asking for decades is, Elvis really in that coffin? Suddenly felt less like conspiracy theory and more like a legitimate scientific inquiry demanding answers. The technology being used that morning at Graceland represented the cutting edge of forensic science, equipment so sophisticated that it could map the internal structure of sealed containers down to the millimeter. Ground-penetrating radar combined with advanced density analysis allowed investigators to essentially see through solid materials, creating detailed three-dimensional models of what lay beneath without disturbing a single grain of soil. These weren't experimental tools wielded by amateur enthusiasts hoping to prove a conspiracy theory. They were the same methodologies used by law enforcement agencies, archaeological teams, and international forensic organizations to solve cases that had gone cold for decades. When applied to Elvis Presley's coffin, they were expected to provide definitive answers that would silence speculation once and for all. Instead, they created more questions than anyone had bargained for. The first significant anomaly appeared in the density readings, which showed that the coffin's contents possessed a different mass profile than what forensic science would predict for human remains interred since 1977. Organic material decomposes in relatively predictable ways over time, and experienced examiners can estimate what they should find based on burial conditions, embalming methods, and elapsed years. The readings from Elvis's coffin fell outside those expected parameters in ways that the lead examiner described as statistically notable. This didn't prove anything extraordinary on its own, but it was unusual enough to warrant immediate documentation and further analysis. The weight discrepancy proved even more puzzling when subjected to detailed calculation. Based on the scanning data, the estimated total weight of the coffin's contents appeared inconsistent with standard burial profiles for a man of Elvis's documented size. The variance wasn't enormous, but in forensic terms, it was significant, the kind of difference that would prompt investigators in any other context to ask hard questions about what they were actually looking at. Estate representatives present during the examination reportedly grew visibly uncomfortable as the technical team discussed these findings among themselves, their professional shorthand becoming increasingly animated. Historical context gave these anomalies additional weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. The circumstances surrounding Elvis's original burial had generated suspicion almost immediately after his death, with witnesses and insiders raising concerns that were never adequately addressed. Several people who viewed Elvis's body during the brief open casket period at Graceland reported that something seemed off about his appearance. His complexion looked artificial. His features seemed subtly wrong, and the overall presentation struck some observers as more theatrical than funerary. At the time, these impressions were attributed to grief shock, and the disorienting nature of viewing someone so famous in such vulnerable circumstances. But the examination findings gave these old testimonies new relevance, suggesting that perhaps those witnesses had perceived something genuine that deserved more serious consideration. The decision to conduct secondary verification scans came quickly, driven by a recognition that preliminary findings this unusual required additional confirmation before anyone could responsibly discuss them. A second team of specialists was brought in to repeat the analysis using slightly different methodologies, providing an independent check on the original data. The estate insisted on this additional step, understanding that whatever conclusions emerged would face intense public scrutiny and needed to be bulletproof against accusations of error or bias. For nearly 6 hours, Graceland's meditation garden became an active forensic site, with technicians running calculations and comparing results, while security personnel maintained a perimeter against any possibility of outside observation. When the secondary examination concluded, the findings proved troublingly consistent with the initial scans. Both analyses showed the same density anomalies, the same weight discrepancies, and the same departure from expected burial profiles. One forensic specialist reportedly described the results as inconclusive in ways that are themselves significant, a careful phrasing that acknowledged the limits of what the technology could prove, while refusing to dismiss what it had revealed. Another team member declined to sign the preliminary report, requesting additional time to analyze the data before committing her professional reputation to any official conclusion. Something in that coffin, or perhaps something conspicuously absent from it, had transformed what should have been a straightforward verification into a genuine forensic puzzle. The scientists had come to Graceland expecting to confirm the obvious and end decades of speculation with hard evidence. Instead, they departed with encrypted data files, preliminary reports marked confidential, and the uncomfortable awareness that Elvis Presley's final resting place held secrets that modern technology could detect but not yet explain. Long before forensic scientists arrived at Graceland with their advanced imaging equipment, the theories about Elvis Presley's death had already taken on a life of their own. For nearly 5 decades, a dedicated community of researchers, fans, and self-proclaimed investigators had insisted that the official story contained gaps too significant to ignore. Some believed Elvis had faked his death to escape the crushing pressure of fame, retreating into anonymity, while the world mourned a man who was actually sipping coffee somewhere in quiet obscurity. Others constructed more elaborate narratives involving witness protection programs, government operations, or medical experiments that required Elvis to disappear from public life entirely. These theories varied wildly in their plausibility, but they shared one common foundation: the conviction that what happened in August 1977 was not as straightforward as the authorities claimed. The examination findings breathed new oxygen into speculation that many had dismissed as the desperate fantasies of people unable to accept loss. Suddenly, the density anomalies and weight discrepancies documented by legitimate forensic professionals gave theorists something they had always lacked: scientific data suggesting that official accounts might be incomplete. Online communities that had kept these discussions alive for decades experienced a surge of new interest, with longtime researchers feeling vindicated after years of being mocked as conspiracy obsessives. The findings didn't prove their theories correct, but they accomplished something almost as valuable in their eyes. They proved that the questions themselves deserved serious consideration. What makes Elvis unique among celebrity death conspiracies is the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence that theorists have accumulated over the years. The misspelled middle name on his original grave marker, where Aaron appeared instead of the Iran that Elvis himself used throughout his life, struck many observers as an error too fundamental to be accidental. The life insurance policy that Elvis maintained, reportedly worth millions, was allegedly never claimed by his estate, a detail that seemed inexplicable if his death was genuine but perfectly logical if he had orchestrated his own disappearance. Sightings accumulated over the decades, with witnesses across the country reporting encounters with elderly men who bore striking resemblances to an aged Elvis, some of them occurring in locations that seemed too coincidental to dismiss entirely. None of this evidence would satisfy a court of law or a peer-reviewed scientific journal, but it created a pattern that sustained belief across generations of devoted investigators. The examination findings slotted into this existing framework as the most significant development in decades, lending technological credibility to suspicions that had previously relied on eyewitness accounts and documentary analysis. Researchers who had spent years assembling timelines, interviewing witnesses, and cataloging anomalies finally felt that mainstream attention might validate their work. Yet the forensic data also highlighted the limitations of what any examination could definitively establish. Even if the coffin's contents proved anomalous, multiple explanations existed that didn't require Elvis to have survived his death. Unusual embalming practices common in the 1970s might account for unexpected density readings. Memorial items placed in the coffin alongside the body could alter weight distribution in unpredictable ways. Modifications made during the transfer of Elvis's remains from their original burial site to the meditation garden might have introduced variables that contemporary forensic models couldn't anticipate. The examination had opened doors, but walking through them required interpretive leaps that science alone could not justify. The human impact of this renewed uncertainty rippled through communities that had organized their grief around the belief that Elvis rested peacefully at Graceland. For devoted fans who had visited the meditation garden to pay respects, the suggestion that the grave might not contain what they believed felt like a violation of sacred ground. Others experienced the findings as liberating confirmation that their private doubts had been reasonable all along, that their inability to fully accept Elvis's death reflected something genuine rather than pathological denial. Then came the testimony that nobody had anticipated. Just weeks after the examination findings began circulating through research communities, a former Graceland employee reached out to investigators with claims that threatened to upend everything. This individual, now elderly and reportedly in declining health, had worked at the estate during the critical period surrounding Elvis's death and its immediate aftermath. For decades, this person had remained silent, bound by loyalty, legal agreements, or simple fear of not being believed. But the examination findings had apparently loosened something, compelling a confession that the official timeline of events contained deliberate gaps that the world had never been told about. When all the forensic data is analyzed and every theory examined under harsh light, what remains is something simpler and more profound than any conspiracy could contain. The examination of Elvis Presley's coffin revealed genuine anomalies that legitimate scientists found difficult to explain through conventional means. The density readings, the weight discrepancies, the patterns that deviated from expected burial profiles, all of this exists in documented form, analyzed by professionals with no stake in proving any particular narrative. Yet even these findings cannot deliver the definitive answer that so many have sought for nearly half a century. The technology detected something unusual, but science alone cannot bridge the gap between detection and certainty. Perhaps that ambiguity is exactly what this story was always destined to produce. Elvis Presley existed at a scale that ordinary explanations struggle to accommodate, and it seems fitting that even his death would resist the tidy conclusions we typically demand. The former Graceland employee's testimony, still being verified and analyzed by researchers, adds another layer to an already complex picture without resolving its fundamental mysteries. This individual claims to possess knowledge about the hours following Elvis's death that contradicts official records, but claims require corroboration, and corroboration takes time. The truth, if it emerges at all, will arrive on its own schedule rather than ours. What deserves attention is not merely the question of what lies inside that coffin, but why millions of people care so desperately about the answer. Elvis Presley represented transformation in its purest form. The shy, impoverished kid from Tupelo who became the most electrifying performer the world had ever witnessed. His rise embodied possibility itself, the radical American idea that origins need not determine destinations. And when that story ended in bathroom at Graceland with a bloated, pharmaceutically ravaged body discovered by his girlfriend, it felt less like a death and more like a betrayal. The king who had conquered everything proved unable to conquer himself. And that truth carried a weight that many hearts simply refused to accept. The survival theories that have persisted across decades are not really about Elvis hiding in some quiet corner of the world, living out his days in peaceful anonymity. They are about us, about our refusal to let the story end on such a diminished note, our insistence that someone who burned so brightly deserved an exit more befitting his legend. Every reported sighting, every analyzed photograph, every examination of burial anomalies serves the same psychological function. These investigations keep Elvis present in a world that feels somehow diminished by his absence, allowing each generation to discover him anew and add their own chapter to his mythology. The examination findings, whatever their ultimate interpretation, accomplished something remarkable simply by existing. They demonstrated that nearly 50 years after Elvis Presley's reported death, the world still cares enough to deploy cutting-edge technology in pursuit of answers about his fate. That level of sustained cultural investment speaks to something deeper than celebrity obsession or conspiracy addiction. It reveals how certain figures transcend their historical moment to become permanent fixtures in our collective imagination, touchstones that each generation inherits and reinterprets according to its own needs. Elvis's genuine legacy requires no forensic verification to establish its validity. The artists who cite him as their primary influence span every genre and generation, from rock pioneers to contemporary performers who weren't born until decades after his death. The template he created for modern celebrity, the merchandising, the movies, the carefully managed public image, remains the blueprint that today's entertainment industry follows, whether consciously or not. His voice, captured in recordings that technology continues to enhance and preserve, still fills rooms with an emotional power that time has not diminished. These things are real in ways that theories about Coffin contents can never match. Maybe the greatest revelation from this entire episode has nothing to do with forensic anomalies or insider testimony. Maybe what the examination truly uncovered was the depth of feeling that Elvis Presley still commands. The way his name can still make hearts beat faster and arguments erupt among strangers. In the ways that genuinely matter. In influence, in emotional connection, in the capacity to make people feel something powerful across the distance of decades. Elvis Presley never really left us at all. The mystery of what lies inside that coffin may never be completely solved, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself a gift. It ensures that the conversation continues, that new generations keep asking questions, and that the king remains exactly where he has always belonged, alive in the hearts of everyone still listening. The examination opened doors that may never fully close. What do you believe those findings actually revealed, and why does Elvis still matter so deeply after all these years? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the untold chapters of the King's extraordinary legacy.